It's different now, of course, but there was a time when only men reported from the front lines of war. A shy young woman from Mount Morgan in Queensland followed in the footsteps of the pioneering women who had reported on the Second World War. Dorothy Drain was one of the first Australian female war correspondents, reporting from several conflicts, including wars in both Korea and Vietnam. She also became a legendary editor of the Australian Women's Weekly. So how did Dorothy break down the barriers? And how did she make reporting in war so different?
Dorothy's fabulous writing career nearly didn't happen. While at school, she was misdiagnosed as having a severe eye condition, and a doctor instructed her not to read for 2 years.
Dorothy was always destined to be a journalist, really. She had what was referred to in those days as ink in her veins.
Dr. Janine Baker has researched Dorothy and written about her in her book.
When she was at high school, she contributed regularly to the school newspaper. She won a statewide essay competition.
Dorothy's nephew, Kenneth Hayne, is the proud keeper of her scrapbooks.
It must have been overwhelming to see what she saw. We always used to call her Dos, and what I remember is a very bright, intelligent, able, strong, very witty, very funny woman. She had always read widely, and she, I think, always aspired to write clearly, simply, directly.
The 1933 census shows that only about 10% of journalists were women.
But in her various daily newspaper roles, Dorothy was restricted to writing in the social pages. There was one publication, however, where women could write about serious matters, the Australian Women's Weekly, and Dorothy joined the weekly in 1938.
Dorothy saw firsthand the devastation of war. In 1946, just after the Second World War, she spent more than 3 months in Japan writing about Australians serving with the British Commonwealth Occupation Force. She was extremely moved during a visit to Hiroshima, still a wasteland from the atomic bomb dropped by the Americans the previous year. Tens of thousands were killed when the nuclear explosion wiped out that city, and thousands more were dying from radiation sickness. Dorothy would later write of the insane futility of war.
In 1950, Dorothy was sent to cover a military conflict involving Australians in Malaya, then the war in Korea.
She wrote home from Korea saying that she thought that war was a shame and it made her feel sick.
When she went to Vietnam in 1965, she saw what seemed to be a huge number of coffins waiting on the tarmac. And she said it seared her mind, but she would never write about it.
Dorothy did write about the thoughts, feelings and activities of our soldiers in camp and behind the scenes.
6:30 a.m. first light. We take off with a load of parachutes and assorted servicemen, Vietnamese, American, Australian. Below us, a tracery of muddy stream through jungle makes a paisley pattern of green and brown.
Dorothy Drain undoubtedly wrote from a woman's perspective. She was a very compassionate person. She was very interested in humanity. She knew that the women reading the Women's Weekly were the mothers and the sisters, and the daughters of the men who were serving in Korea and Japan and Vietnam. She always had them in her mind.
She made no apology for being a woman in war zones. She, I think, always struggled against the fact that the forces she was visiting, the Americans particularly in Korea, didn't quite know what to do with a female correspondent.
There were a lot of excuses that were used. The primary one was that there were no facilities for women, which means no women's toilets or no accommodations. There was a belief that women couldn't be trusted with sensitive military information, that they would stick out too much.
Dorothy's column, It Seems to Me, gave sharp insights into current events and was hugely popular for 16 years.
2 infuriated gentlemen of my acquaintance have been haranguing anyone who will listen on the sins of the ABC concerning the test broadcasts.
Dorothy became the weekly's news editor, then assistant editor, before being appointed editor in 1972. She also became a board member of the company. She retired in 1975 with a proud legacy of informing Australians for almost 4 decades.
She believed, and I think with real cause, that a lot of women in Australia got their news through the weekly. Not just fashion and recipes, but the real intellectual grit in it was the news, and she thought that was terribly important to the readership.
She showed women that you could have a successful career in journalism and you could get to the top. She was the editor of the most successful women's magazine in Australia.
Well, the little girl with the big glasses, who was once prevented from reading for 2 years, certainly made up for lost time. Dorothy Drain loved words, and she passed on the joy of reading to countless Australians through her own writing and through her magazine's reporters when she was in charge as the editor. As a war correspondent, she gave her readers valuable insights beyond the usual battle reports. Dorothy Drain truly was an inspiration to journalists, especially to women.